Well, hello everyone. I'd like to introduce Mike a little bit and explain why he is qualified to be the moderator tonight. Michael was in China in the 1990s during a time when the adoption of Chinese infants by the international community began. He was a journalist in China for about 7 years, so he's very familiar with the social conditions of China during the one-child policy and then the beginning of the adoption period. Then he became a journalist for the Washington Post. Last year, when the international adoption program was terminated in China, Michael did a story about that, published in the Washington Post. So Michael was kind of in China at the beginning of this process and was at the end with this report. And then finally, I have to confess that Michael happens to be my son-in-law. So when I asked him to moderate, he couldn't say no.
All right, well, great to see everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I don't know that I'm qualified, but I'm happy to be here. Within our family, she's Lao Lao, but for tonight, I guess she'll be Vivian. You know, she's listed as the editor and translator of this book, but she is in many ways much more than that. She has been involved in this project. It started a very, very long time ago, and it started out of an interest in helping the adoptive families be able to learn more about where their daughters came from. So I think it would be helpful to sort of set the scene, the main characters, as it were. Vivian is one of them, and I think it would be helpful for people to just know a little bit about how you came to leave China as a young girl, and also why you got into what is essentially the ultimate sort of bridge-building career, which is teaching generations of people how to speak Chinese and more.
Well, I heard the word generations. That means I am very old. You're right about that. I'm 81 years old, and I have students who have retired, so I am indeed very old. Well, my official career has been as an academic. I taught language and literature. That was my official job. But my mission for, I would say, half a century has been a bridge for dialogue between the peoples of the US and China, because the focus of my academic career for this, at least the second half, has been directing study abroad programs in China. And I'm a true believer in immersion education. For a young person to understand a culture in a deep way, that person needs to be immersed in that culture. And that means learning the language in that situation. And by immersion, I tell the students, it's like taking a shower. If you want to take a shower, you have to get under the shower and get completely soaked and be involved with the people there. So this book has everything to do with my lifelong mission, building a bridge of dialogue. Not only being part of the bridge myself, but nurturing young people to become part of that bridge. So how did I get involved with this book in particular? In 2008, this was 1 year after I myself adopted a teenager from China. I was living in California at the time. A group of families who have adopted girls, they're all girls at that time, decided to have a reunion of their families in Seattle. 1 year before that, vice mayor of this town, who also oversaw the social services, including the orphanage, had written a book called, the Chinese title was Love Across International Borders. Very similar to the English title that I gave this book ultimately. Anyway, he had published a book 1 year before on this subject, but it was written for a Chinese audience. It was in Chinese. But hearing about this reunion, he decided to give every family a copy of this book. So of course, none of them could read it. So they sent out an appeal for translators to just give them a rough idea of what this book is all about. And I volunteered, but as soon as I dived into this book, I thought this book really deserves to have a wider audience, audience in the West, because it has a perspective that I have never seen in any other publication about adoptions from China. So that was 2008, and I decided that, okay, I'll make this a project someday. But life kind of intervened, and I did finish the translation for these families. But it wasn't until last year, 2024, when the international adoption program was terminated, that I thought, well, here's an unfinished project that I have to finish while I'm still here on Earth. So that's how I got back to this project. Now, I have kind of lost track of your question. How did I get interested in this subject and so on?
Why did you want to be a bridge builder, I guess?
As a young person, I never thought about it. I just kind of got into it and discovered that this role is really very well suited for. I was born in China, spent my childhood partly in Hong Kong, partly in Taiwan, and was transplanted to America, to Washington, D.C., in fact, when I was 11. And I became totally bilingual. You know, thinking back on it, I'm very well suited for this. As a young person, though, I aspired to become an architect, somebody like Maya Lin, who designed the Vietnam Memorial. But a long story short, I ended up being another kind of architect, a bridge builder for dialogue. And I found that wherever I go, whether it be in China or in the US, I am very effective as a person who brings two sides together, who could help them understand each other. And this was very notable in China in the 1990s, when China first reopened to the Western world. And Western scholars, they had this pent-up hunger to understand China, so they go to China. But any of you who lived in China in those years, as a foreigner, you still lived in a bubble. There were different systems, really made it hard for you to be really immersed with the people. And so in that kind of situation, I discovered that people really envied me and they relied on me to be kind of the conduit.
Let me ask you a little bit about the timing. You mentioned that China shut down the foreign adoption program last year. I had the occasion to speak to this family on the screen last year who had been trying to adopt a daughter for about 5 years, and it was quite moving to hear their story and to what had been just such a point of cooperation between the United States and China for decades. By that point, more than 80,000 Chinese babies, toddlers, some young children had been adopted into U.S. families. This is a sort of an incredible stretch of time and an incredibly large number, but it just in terms of the timing here, what's the relevance of your book now that adoption is finished?
The adoption of Chinese babies by the international community, it became legal in 1991. And China passed two laws, 1993 and 1995, that set up a system for these adoptions. And an office called the China Center for Adoption Affairs was set up. So that was 30 years ago. The US and China were in a honeymoon. If you can think back to 30 years ago, 1995. I do remember this scenario, and some of you who here in the audience might remember this. In 1998, Clinton went to China in July. It was very hot. I saw Clinton and the Chinese premier, Jiang Zemin, walking across Tiananmen Square on their way into the Hall of the People. In front of a throng of international audience, these are hand-picked people. It was a moment of China-US relations at its high point. But I felt it was a little tense because the two leaders were not able to communicate with each other. And it was hot and they were dressed very formally. So I started clapping myself, which is, you know, kind of a stupid thing to do, actually. But then everyone else, it just started this wave of clapping as though everybody else were on cue to do this. 30 years later, US-China relations has made a 180-degree turn. I see now we're looking down a chasm of geopolitical conflict dominated by these two superpowers. And I thought, well, this piece of history about the adoption of Chinese children by Americans is a very heartwarming story of warm relationships between our two countries 30 years ago. And that piece of the history is still alive today, and it will always be. So I just felt it was very important to remind ourselves of that strand of good US-China relations, especially at this time. And then the other factor is, now that the international adoption program has terminated, and these children, 86,000 about in the US, have now come of age, on average probably in their 20s. And this is a very good time to look back on what has happened. So the timing is good.
Yeah. The other thing that I found interesting in reading this book is sort of other main character here, which is Ni Wen-sai, the guy that originally wrote this book. As you portray it, he's sort of the bureaucrat with a heart. He's not a bad guy, as you sort of describe him. And he wrote a historic novel that became a TV series. And the other thing that sort of really shined through in your portrayal of him was his just intense interest in what happened to what he called the 600 daughters of Gaoyou, this community where the girls came from, where all these adoptions originated. So I'm interested in how much of it was that you were drawn to him as a person and the way that he approached things. How much of that got you into doing this book?
Well, this is a good point to show you a picture of Mr. Ni. I became pretty involved with the author of this book. Shortly after I completed this translation in 2008 for the families having the reunion, I didn't go to China specifically to meet Mr. Ni, but I was in China and I made a point of going to Gaoyou to get to know him and to visit this orphanage. And before I answer your question, I'll show some pictures of how I got involved with the families too. So in 2008, I met Mr. Ni in July, and shortly before the families had a reunion. A total of about 600 children were adopted from this one orphanage, and there are a few in the Washington, D.C. area. But in the Seattle area alone, there were this many at the reunion. And this is Mr. Ni at the reunion. He had hoped to go to Seattle, but because he was still a Chinese official, he wasn't able to get a visa. So he joined them on Zoom. And then I became pretty involved with this particular family who is featured prominently in the book. The girl in this picture is the cover girl to the book. The boy, this is a boy, and they were able to adopt a boy because he was a special needs child. That means a child with some ailment or some congenital problem. And I also had a reunion with them just last year. The second person on the right, that's the girl that's on the cover of the book. So back to Mr. Ni. Mr. Ni is a very unusual person as Chinese bureaucrats go. He was the first group of young people coming out of the Cultural Revolution, got into a college. And right after he finished college, he decided to go to Australia, where he got a master's degree in something like political science. I think it was during that time that he acquired this international outlook. He's always very interested in how Westerners think about the same issues. For example, how do they think about adoption? And there's a huge sort of opposite attitudes between the Chinese and Westerners about adoptions. So writing his book was his way of coming to some understanding about this whole process. The book is largely based on his correspondence with the adoptive families, mostly Americans, but a few Europeans as well. In 2005, he did something very daring for a Chinese bureaucrat. It would be even more daring if he did it today. He reached out to all the families who had children from his district that he considers them daughters of Gaoyou. He sent them Christmas cards, and then some of them responded, and then he followed up with a questionnaire. How are your daughters doing? Tell us about how they're doing. I don't think something like that could be done today. In fact, when China set up this international adoption program, it kind of promised all these adoptive families that their connection with China is from now on cut off. The birth families are not going to seek you out. This is they use the word clean adoption. Chinese people don't do a lot of adoptions, but when they do, they have different reasons from Westerners. One thing for sure, they want it to be absolutely clean. So much so that they sometimes keep it a secret within the family. And to me, that's very amazing. How can you keep something like that secret? Okay, but they do. So for Mr. Ni to reach out to these families is just very contrary to Chinese culture. Does that answer your question?
It does, it does. I was really interested, one of the dads, Charles Day, there was sort of an ambivalence about the way that he was handling a difficult situation. It was compelling to me as a dad and as someone who tries to figure out information. He wanted, for his daughter's sake, to find out everything he could about the background of her mom. What was the situation? Why did she give her up? Why did she abandon her? What was the story there? What is the story now? And he couldn't figure out any of those things. So his sort of backup plan was to describe everything he could about this place, Gaoyou. He was going to try to give the broader community as much information as he could, in part because he couldn't give his daughter what she actually wanted. It was a sort of a melancholy, but also kind of a powerful thing. Will you talk a little bit about that he comes back, he tries to seek all the information he can?
Yes. Okay. A lot of the adoptive parents, when they adopt a child from China, have this nagging feeling that they have plucked this child off of its roots. And they also suspect that the child someday, sooner or later, will want to find their roots. So the adoptive parents want to be prepared for that. In some cases, this kind of obsession with roots seem to be even stronger with the parents than with the children. Not all adopted children care. I mean, some of them do very much, but some of them, for whatever reason, do not. But a lot of these parents, the only roots that they could get back to is the orphanage from which the child came. Whereas the child may not be even from that town. Most of the adopted babies are from the outlying rural areas, and they were brought to the orphanage. I can explain why that is later. But the attitude of the adoptive parents is that they want to find the roots and have it be ready for their child when their child wants it. Charles Day, their daughter, was found in a food market. It's one of these sort of big traditional farmers market types. I used the word where the abandoned child was found. This is an important point. The adoptive families use the term the finding site. They avoid the term abandoned site because abandon has a negative connotation. So Charles Day says this about the finding site. The Zhongshikou market has a special significance for me because it is the finding site for our daughter. It is quite an experience to walk through the market and neighborhood and imagine that day in February 2003 when a mother came down to the market and left a precious little girl wrapped in a ski jacket. I wish I could meet her and tell her how beautiful her daughter is and how well she is doing, but it is not to be. And here's another passage from the book that I find very touching. The adoptive parents feel a certain loss and would want to make every effort to retrieve information about their children's origins. They piece together whatever bits and pieces of information they can find in trying to formulate a relatively complete picture of the beginning of their children's life. Sometimes small mundane objects become priceless treasures to them. Things like a little baby bunting or a hand-sewn cloth shoe. These are all seen as emblematic of the loving care the newborn child received. The finding sites are vital for the adoptive parents to visit because they are compelled to stand at those very spots to envision their child's birth parents and the circumstances of abandoning the child.
Do you want to just do a little bit about why Americans and other Westerners ended up adopting so many girls from China?
For American families wishing to adopt, there are two ways to go. You can adopt domestically, you can adopt internationally. The problems with domestic adoption are very clear, and I won't go into those. For those who wish to adopt internationally, in the 90s, when the Chinese adoptions began, China had a reputation of having a very well-regulated program. Children were well taken care of. The ones that are available for adoption are well cared for. They're healthy. They always come with a medical report and so on. So that's one reason. Another reason is that China had a humanitarian crisis. This is what many Westerners felt. It made them, their wish to help with China's humanitarian crisis. And then lastly, I think that the Chinese children have this mystique of being beautiful and smart. In fact, in the correspondence between the families and Mr. Ni, many of the families use the phrase, my daughter is beautiful, And Mr. Ni wrote in his book, I saw the pictures of these children and I don't think they're particularly beautiful. Maybe the Westerners have a different aesthetic sense. And then as for this aura of being smart, I heard this joke about an American family adopting a Chinese child, and she turned out not to be a math genius, and they were kind of disappointed.
Will you tell people about the naming convention? I found this very interesting as a bad learner of Chinese. It was particularly interesting, but tell the story of that. Every girl that was adopted out had the same last name, and you go on from there. Yeah.
Oh, okay. When children end up at an orphanage, they are very lonely. They're no longer with the family, but the orphanage tried to give them a sense of family. So all the children who end up in the same orphanage have a surname that is the same, related to the location. So in Gaoyou, all the children at the orphanage have the surname Gao, which means tall. But this orphanage did something a little unusual. That is to give all the children who were brought to the orphanage in the same year the same middle name. Now, this is a practice that the Chinese people use for siblings within the same family. So in my generation, the middle name is Zhi, which means ambition. All my siblings, all my cousins have the same middle name. So at this orphanage, probably at the direction of the Mr. Ni, all the children brought in the same year have the same middle name. So whenever a family goes to the orphanage and said, my daughter has the middle name, blah, blah, Mr. Ni said, I can tell exactly what year she came to the orphanage. So Mr. Ni chose to, apply a Chinese cultural practice to the children brought there.
One of the interesting things you did in this book was to take the original manuscript and then augment it with your own reporting. You tracked down many people, young women around the country in the US who had been adopted from this place. This question is much too broad, but from the people that you met, how has it gone for them? What challenges have they faced? It's too broad, but just in whatever few examples you have.
There are two questions there, actually. One is, how did I make this book relevant or to present this book to a Western audience? And the other question is, what are some of the issues that came up to bring it out to a Western audience 17 years later? It needed two things. It needed to have a broader perspective about the, sort of an overview of international adoptions, so that it doesn't seem like kind of seeing the situation through the lens of one orphanage and kind of rose-colored lens. The other challenge was to bring the book up to date. That is what has happened to these children now that they have grown up. So I did those two things. And in the process of updating the book, I came across some real surprises. One was I found a pair of sisters adopted from the same orphanage, and they did not know anything about this until one was around age 20 and the other was 18. And it came about because I contacted all the families featured in the book that I could find. And one of the mothers said, well, you know, my daughter has found a sister. So that's how I found this pair of sisters. On January 20th, 2022, the two of us, total strangers to each other at the time, received the most stunning news of our life. And it talks about how through 23andMe, they discovered each other. Then when we made the discovery, we needed to assure ourselves that the news from 23andMe was real, for it felt too surreal to both of us. Now, I can show you a photo of these sisters in a moment. The other discovery I made was through research in Chinese social media. It's surprising that it came through Chinese social media, but anyway, I found a family, ended up adopting 11 children from China, okay? And to summarize their story, I'll read this passage. While our first two adopted children were healthy, abandoned only because of their gender, Sophia, that is their third adopted child, Sophia's adoption, our third, with a severe heart condition, began a new chapter in our lives. By 2016, we had welcomed 8 more orphans from China into our home, all with special needs, each with their own unique challenges and gifts. And this is truly the most kind of outstanding story in this book. So I found some nice surprises. At the time the original Chinese book was published, that was 2007, the children were all fairly young, I would say under 5. And from the correspondence from the parents, it seemed like they were all growing up very well, you know, well-adjusted and so on. But Mr. Lee had already foreseen that problems will arise as the children become older, as they leave the cocoon of their homes and go to school, meet up with other children. Mr. Lee had also studied the phenomenon of the Korean children's adoption by Americans in the 1950s and 1960s and the problems that arose with that group. So in a way, writing this book, one purpose was to prepare the families for some of the problems that will arise when the children want to seek the roots and so on, that he could be the link, he could be the bridge for that. So what are some of the problems that arose? One would be sense of belonging. You know, they have their families that adopted them, but the question is, how did I become an orphan? Why was I abandoned? You can say, well, that's an unintended consequence of the one-child policy. Your birth parents were deprived of you because of that. But this type of answer doesn't really satisfy that yearning. So this sense of belonging. I'll read you a passage that really touched me. This is by a young child, being very well brought up, but still has this yearning for her own birth mother. So she writes this letter to the imaginary birth mother she doesn't know. It says, Mom, I really miss you. Although I cannot imagine what you look like, I believe you must be a kind and intelligent person. I would like to know how you're doing. Where are you? If I knew where you are, I would come see you and give you hugs and kisses. If I cannot find you, I will have this regret all my life. Are you in heaven or still living on earth? I love you more than anything else in the whole world. Imagine how the adoptive mother feels when she comes across a letter like that. You know, I think the mother would have very mixed feelings. So sense of belonging, identity issue, some of these issues don't come up until the person becomes an adult. One young woman, very successful, featured in the book, writes the following: I walked the streets and daydreamed about what my life might have been like if I had always lived there. This is where I was abandoned, found, and cared for, and adopted. One of the most touching moments of my visit to the orphanage was meeting the nanny who had cared for me. And then a bit later she says, in recent years, I've come to know my anger and ambiguous grief more intimately. I've realized that there had always been an undercurrent of loss deep inside. I ache for my family, culture, language, tradition, and more. It's natural for these children to grow up with issues like this, but for the most part, they get resolved, sometimes through therapy and so on. And then there are some issues that are related to any kind of adoption, not particularly adoption from China. When the child is obviously different, genetically different from the parents, when the child goes to school, classmates are like, you know, your mom is she really your mom? She can't be your mom. You don't look like her. Then, depending on where the child grows up, there could be racism, not nearly as to the degree that the Korean adoptees faced a generation earlier. And then something else that's not related particularly to China adoptions is the unknown quantities from this child's early life. Even before birth, you can imagine if you were a woman in China expecting a child, you already had a daughter, you're hoping for a son, and you're jumping through a lot of legal hoops in order to have a second child. And you're wondering, you know, is this child going to be a boy or not? You know, that kind of anxiety that the mother goes through. And then upon the birth of the child, turns out to be a girl, you can imagine the trauma on the mother that could be kind of visited on the child as well. So early childhood trauma, you know, that people don't know about, including prenatal anxiety, would have an impact. But this isn't particularly the case with adoptions from China. You know, adopted children adopted in this country, often there are these issues.
There has been reporting by foreign journalists in China about some of the abuses connected with the adoption program. There's a reporter, Barbara Demick, who was at the LA Times, and she wrote a story in 2009, the headline of which was "Stolen Babies, Supply, Adoption, Demand." This was her summary of the situation as she's seen it. She's since come out with a book on this topic recently. She wrote, "The conventional wisdom is that babies, mostly girls, were abandoned by their parents because of the traditional preference for boys and China's restrictions on family size. No doubt that was the case for tens of thousands of girls. But," she wrote, "some parents are beginning to come forward to tell harrowing stories of babies who were taken away by coercion, fraud, or kidnapping, sometimes by government officials who covered their tracks by pretending that the babies had been abandoned." How do you deal with the issue of abuses in the context of your book?
This is a big issue when I was in the process of producing this book. Western publications on this subject, I broadly classify them into academic community and the journalism community. But journalism covers newsworthy topics. So, for example, in 1995, I think that was the year, when a big scandal that happened in Hunan involving trafficking of babies from Guangdong province, trafficked to Hunan province, and supplied the orphanages that were getting these babies adopted by foreigners. That was a huge scandal in China and got great coverage in the West. Either way, whether they are by scholars or by journalists, they have a Western perspective. And these things are true. I won't deny it. But we don't know what percentage of the adoptions from China are tainted by this kind of corruption. I can just feel for the adoptive parents hoping that, you know, my child was not involved in something like that. So how did I deal with it? I wrote an overview, a prologue, pretty substantial prologue to this book. The adoption phenomenon, I see it as an elephant. No publication can do justice to all the parts of this elephant, but I do give a broad outline of that elephant in the prologue, and then the rest of the book is about the specific cases involving this particular orphanage. So that's how I dealt with it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would also just follow up with that. How is your book sort of different than other books out there on adoption?
Well, I think it is quite unique in the bilateral perspective. Original Chinese author who already had a pretty international outlook. And then I, as an American, collaborated with him. I see it as a bridge for dialogue. I guess that's it. I mean, it's based on the correspondence, but it also talks about the subject in a way that both sides can engage in it without getting overly emotional.
You talk about the correspondence. There was a very touching moment in there. Maybe you could describe it or read from the book in that section, but with a girl who lost her Chinese. She no longer could speak Chinese, but then she goes on to meet a new member of her family. Will you tell that story?
Well, I've already read some correspondence by the adults, but I found the correspondence from the children to be especially touching, okay? This is a letter written by an 8-year-old addressed to the nannies of the orphanage from which she was adopted. The passage that I will read is from a 10-year-old girl. So this letter is addressed to Mr. Lee. She says, "When I was adopted, I was almost 3 years old. I told my parents, through a translator, that I loved Chinese and that I would not speak English. I said I would learn English but not speak it. But I did learn English, and then I tried to speak English and Chinese together." What does that mean? Okay, she says, for instance, I would never just say water. I would say water, 水, and then she goes on, "Sadly, after my first 8 months in America, I did forget all my Chinese. When we went to get my sister Holly," this is a second child now from China, "I cried and cried that I had lost my Chinese words. That's one of the reasons that in 2001, my family moved to China to help me learn Chinese again because I loved it so much." Yeah, sometimes the parents, in their desire to give their children a sense of roots, would move the whole family back to China to live for a few years.
I want to make sure that there's time for questions, but will you show people the other pictures that we may have missed along the way?
Yes, we missed a lot of pictures. This is the market from which the cover girl of the book was found by someone and took her to the orphanage. So the father came back to this market and just walked the aisles and imagined, there's another passage that I want to read to you from another father who wanted to give their children a sense of pride in their Chinese root. He uses a metaphor here. "Children from Gaoyou, you come from a background that many might consider poor and of little status. But just as those dumplings are as perfect and as fit for their purpose as anything prepared in the finest kitchen, so you, dumplings, are as fine and fit for success and the purpose of life as anyone from anywhere on earth. As the ingredients here are grown and harvested daily from the land, prepared with great care and precision, and have great nutritional value, and as they come from the honest labor of good people, so the spirit and capabilities within you are genuine and rich, and you have much to offer to those you love and to the world. The wealth of your home people is not wealth, as most people count wealth. However, your people are wise, kind, strong, industrious, and care for each other. What wealth is greater than that? You have a rich heritage from your people." One thing that the adoptive families, many of them do, is to bring their children back to the orphanage, back to China. The photo on the left is this pair of twins adopted by, I think they're Swedish parents. They were almost 1 year old when they were adopted. And then the picture on the right is probably about 8 years later when they returned. And in this picture, I want to say something about this orphanage. The two signs here, one says Gaoyou Child Welfare Institute. The other says Gaoyou Social Welfare Institute. Now, China typically did not have institutes that are just orphanages. The one in Gaoyou was a general social welfare institute. At one time, it was mostly for the care of elderly people who didn't have families. But with the one-child policy, the abandonment of children, and the adoption of children, the orphanage component of this institute expanded. So different components expand and shrink as need arises. This is another family returning to visit. And that's Mr. Ni in the lower picture, you know, showing the family all the documents, the artifacts, and so on. He really does maintain a link with these families. This is a picture of an adopted girl trying to search for her birth family, not allowing herself to hope too much. The thing that they do is to go back to the hometown where they were found and post a picture of themselves as a baby and also as themselves now with some description, but typically it would have a message like, please know that I am doing well and my family is taking good care of me. Now, why do they do that? Because number one, they don't dare hope too much that they will find a family. But then, even if they do, if the family can identify them, they just want the family to know that they're doing well. Sort of a one-way kind of comforting. The taller woman here is the one who wrote that she has feeling of loss. Anyway, that is the nanny that took care of her 20 years ago. And the orphanage also keeps photos the family sent back and they keep it there. These are the two sisters who discovered each other. And when they first saw each other, they were quite astounded because aside from the facial features, they had their hair the same way, even the kind of the body language, that sort of thing. So they have become very close. And it turns out that one was in Idaho and the other was in the Seattle area, so not very far from each other. The family that I told you about that ended up with 11 children, many families would adopt a second child to give the first child a sense of family because they are both from China. Not all of them, but many of them will. So this family adopted a second child, but shortly after that, they heard about another child from the same orphanage who had been adopted by an American family, but the medical exam revealed that she had a very serious heart issue. So this American family kind of rejected her, turned her back to the orphanage. So when the family that adopted the second child heard about this, they said, this is practically a sister to our child, so let's adopt her as well. When they did that, the doctor said, well, her survival rate is probably not great, but she did recover. And after that, the family kept adopting more children with birth defects or some kind of serious ailment. They ended up with 11, all but one survived, including a boy, a special needs child. And this is at the wedding of their first daughter. And the one that had the heart ailment is Sophia, the one second to the right.
I just wanted to see some of those individual stories. I mean, you've written here a document that sort of outlines in English and with first-person sources what some participants in this massive sort of movement of people, what they thought, what they did. I'm just thinking, as you think up into the future, 10 or 20 years from now, what are you hoping that someone else that reads this historic account, what do you want them to take away from this book?
30 years, 86,000 Chinese children joined American families, and they have by now been fairly woven in the fabric of American society. And I think this is a chapter that really needs to be commemorated. Secondly, now that we are in this very difficult period, I hope it's just a period that will pass, of tense relations between the US and China. We're literally looking down a chasm of geopolitical conflict. In this context, I would like for us to look up at this bridge of good relations between the US and China. This book is about relationships, okay? The relationship between the adopted families and the orphanage, Mr. Li, between the good people in China who facilitated the adoption and the Americans, and also something I didn't have a chance to mention, the relationship between the charitable organizations, American ones, that have improved orphanage care a great deal by launching programs in China at these orphanages. I see this bridge to be very much needed now in holding US-China relations. This is a positive aspect in our relationship that we must not forget.
All right, well, I think it'd be great to get some questions from people here in the audience. So why don't we do that?
I was wondering if you have seen whether community building and meeting other adoptees have supported their mental health and finding community.
When the children were small, the parents did a lot to build community. Their Facebook groups, they do reunions in areas, right here in DC, Maryland, DC, Virginia, have a families with children adopted from China website organization. They have that all over the country. Adopted people who are now young adults are forming community themselves, and several actually in Europe as well. I think that people find it very mutually supportive, especially if the Nanchang project that you mentioned has to do with searching for roots. And that is a very fraught process, okay? It could end in, great joy. It could open a can of worms. Okay, by that I mean some of the corruption in the pipeline of orphans came to light through the process. The families would look at the finding ad that was posted in the newspaper, let's say. This infant was found at such and such a site. They go back to that place and they find it's really not that. That could be one outcome. They need to be kind of fortify themselves and have support through this process.
I was curious of the book's awareness of assimilation into Western lifestyle or anything like that in distinction from more traditional immigration pathways.
The parents who adopt children from China, they tend to, now I'm not saying all of them do this, but they tend to want to have them embrace both cultures. So sometimes they would encourage their children to learn Chinese, learn martial arts, things like that. I have not, done a kind of a survey, but impressionistically, it varies a great deal depending on the area where the family is. In the Seattle area, it's already extremely cosmopolitan, very Asian. The children are, totally comfortable with their racial identity. Elsewhere, there would be problems. Perhaps not particular to the adopted people. The children adopted from China face racism at a certain location. Probably Chinese Americans would as well. But I think having parents that are racially different adds another layer to that.
Could you tell us something about Gaoyou? Where is it?
Oh, yes.
Is it lovely?
Well,
Is it poor?
Gaoyou is a very special place. It's not a big town, not too far from Shanghai, I think most of you know, but closer to Nanjing, which historically has been the capital of China for several dynasties. But Gaoyou first came on the map during the Han Dynasty. That was like 2,000 years ago, over 2,000 years ago, and which gave its name. It means high postal. It was kind of like the Pony Express This is where the emperor, had a route to different parts of the empire where edicts would be sent to. So Gaoyou established itself. And then when the Grand Canal was built during the Ming Dynasty, it was near the southern terminus of the Grand Canal. It's a prosperous, agriculturally fertile area where grains were, gathered and shipped to the capital and so on. Enough importance that Marco Polo chose to come to Gaoyou to visit. So in Gaoyou, you have the statue of Marco Polo. But it is not one of these, advanced towns like Shenzhen, nor is it a big city, but it is comfortable. So that I think the orphanage also better run. I am pretty certain that none of the corruption that we have read about has occurred at this orphanage. Well, thank you.